Good afternoon once again, and welcome to our event on carbon pricing and carbon markets. We have the honor of having with us today Her Excellency Mrs. Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, His Excellency Pedro Sanchez, Prime Minister of Spain, His Excellency Hakainde Hichilema, President of Zambia, His Excellency Mr. Ajay Banga, President of the World Bank, Her Excellency Mrs. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, Director General of the World Trade Organization, and Her Excellency Mrs. Kristalina Georgieva, Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund. I now call President von der Leyen and Prime Minister Sanchez to come. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Acoustics are not optimal, but I try my very best to be heard. Prime Minister, dear Pedro, Mr. President, what a pleasure to have you here. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, ministers, a pleasure to welcome all of you here in our pavilion. We all know if we want to keep global warming below the tipping point of 1.5 degrees, we need to cut global emissions. And there's a way to cut emissions while fostering innovation and growth. Put a price on carbon. It is a market-driven instrument, and the message is very clear. You are polluting, you must pay a price. You want to avoid the payment, well, then innovate and decarbonize. Carbon pricing nudges the private sector towards innovation. It makes heavy polluters pay a fair price. And the revenues can be reinvested in the fight against climate change, in innovation, and in a just transition. This is not only one of the most powerful tools in our hands, it is also one of the most trusted and the most tested. Governments in all continents have embarked on a similar journey. Countries like Zambia, who are joining us today, but many more from Canada, to China, to New Zealand, to Kazakhstan. What brings us here today is our resolve to boost a global movement. Last June in Paris, we launched a call to action to create more carbon markets that are aligned with the Paris Agreement. Today, we're joined by the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO. You have an essential role to play to support and incentivize change. And together we want to advance on three basic goals. First, we want to assist more and more countries to create and complete the domestic carbon markets. Worldwide, there are already 73 carbon pricing instruments in place, but they cover only 23% of global emissions, and that share needs to increase. It will allow for faster reduction of emissions. It will create a level playing field for international trade. And it will raise more revenues for global climate action, including in the developing world. So let us work on putting a price on all CO2 emissions in the world. Second, we need ambitious carbon markets. Carbon pricing must remove carbon. Let me give you some figures deducted from our own experience. In those 18 years since the European Union introduced carbon pricing, emissions covered by our system went down by 40%, while the economy was growing, and we have raised over 175 billion euros in revenues, and these are going exclusively into climate action and in innovation and to developing countries. My third point, of course, voluntary carbon credits can also play a role. We need the private capital to flow into these carbon credits. But the investors also need certainty that these are effective projects. And that's why we need common standards for projects that reduce emissions. We also need private money to flow into projects that enhance biodiversity. Zambia and Kenya, for example, have vast forests, and you deserve that you should be rewarded for keeping them alive. That is of utmost importance. And here too, credits, let's call them nature credits, can play an important role. COP28 is an essential moment to advance towards these three goals. Our aim is to establish the framework for international cooperation and to set a robust benchmark for carbon credit markets. We need diplomacy to bring more countries on board. We need openness to recognize that different countries may set up different kinds of carbon markets. And we need consistency to make sure all efforts contribute to the fight against climate change. No country can do it alone. No institution can do it alone. Today, we are joining forces to bring all the expertise to the table to give carbon pricing and carbon market the push they deserve. Many thanks.
Thank you, Ursula, and thank you all for joining us here today. As Ursula has said, I think that this COP provides historic opportunity to break a new path of increased ambition and international cooperation, an opportunity to overcome climate action implementation challenges in line with both science and equity to ensure that the spirit of Paris lives on. We are all aware that huge financial resources will be needed to transform global development partners and make economies more resilient to climate change. The question is how? How to create enabling environments for financial and technological innovation and cooperation while retaining the benefits of climate actions in terms of job creation and economic growth. And we need to do it without breaking the bank. The IMF has recently estimated the effects on fiscal sustainability of climate policy packages, comparing those that rely on spending and subsidies and those that also make emitters pay. And the results are sobering. Without carbon taxes, debt to GDP ratios would rise by about 50 percentage points. This means that the longer you delay implementing a carbon tax or a carbon market, the worse will your debt situation get. If anything, we need carbon pricing a lot more today than just a few years ago. The effects of climate change are accelerating while costs increase and higher interest rates are threatening investments in the energy transformation. And of course, developing countries continue to face a major financing gap. Increased lending by more climate-focused MDBs will have to play a key role, as Ajay will surely highlight, but it will not be enough to meet the enormous needs of developing at least developed countries. It is no surprise that the leaders assembled at the Africa Climate Summit in September also called for a global carbon taxation regime. The fact that Mr. Ruto and Mr. Hichilema are joining us here today perfectly reflects that. In other words, we need public finance to build trust and to leverage private investments, but also new financing approaches and sources. It is with this in mind that we sponsored the call to action for Paris-aligned carbon markets to help visualize the financial and technical benefits that carbon pricing offers in accelerating the decarbonization of our economies. Carbon pricing gives an incentive to find ways to save energy and switch the greener sources while generating significant new revenues to finance green transition policies, as well to address consequences and impacts of climate change. To realize their full potential, carbon markets need to be carefully designed and implemented. First, they must rely on robust and ambitious standards that are aligned with the Paris Agreement goals. Second, pricing is key. It has to to give clear signals that help economic agents align their investment decisions with international and domestic climate targets without hurting economic prospects. Just look at my country, Spain. Emissions in industrial and power generation facilities have decreased by 52% between 2005, when the EU's emission trading system was born, and last year. Third, part of the revenues should be used to minimize the potential adverse economic and social impact of both the carbon tax and the energy transition, with a focus on the most vulnerable. Since the 2013 reform of the ETS framework in the European Union, Spain has been spending most of its carbon revenue on climate action, helping accelerate our green transformation in a social just way while leading to positive macroeconomic effects. As Ursula has said, we stand ready to share our experience with all those interested in our aim to cover at least 60% of global emissions. Now let me add a few remarks on voluntary markets, as Ursula has said. They can and must play an important complementary role, and I highlight complementary role. For some geographies, they can provide much needed sources of funding. But we need to reinforce their credibility and integrity. This means three things. First, they should deliver real mitigation in host countries. In order to do that, they must be based on high-quality standards aligned to those of regulated markets. Second, participants should prioritize the reduction of emissions across their value chain, ensuring that the use of carbon credits for offsetting purposes is preserved for residual and hard-to-abate emissions. And finally, double counting must be avoided. Emissions reductions should or sold as voluntary credits for international offsetting purpose should not count towards meeting nationally determined contributions. Dear friends, finance is not neutral, and signals are needed. Today, we call on other committed actors, both governments and other public and private stakeholders, to join us and to help us send a strong political signal, to tell the world that carbon markets work for the economy, for the people, and for the planet. And I thank you.
Thank you very much to both of you, and I now call on President Hichilema. President, you have the floor.
I should? Thank you. Thank you very much. First, let me just acknowledge the excellencies that are here, President EU and my colleagues, World Bank, IMF, and Madam Gozi there, and my colleagues who are panelists as well. Let me just thank the EU for this initiative to have this conversation. It's a very important conversation, and for inviting us, Zambia, to participate in this very, very worthwhile exercise, and extremely essential for us to make rapid progress. Let me set the context first. To achieve the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement, we believe we need, in addition to the incremental emissions reduction, we need deep transformation, essential transformation as a supplemental measure or a couple of measures. We must remember that our economies at the moment must conform, are not conforming, and must conform to be what we call low carbon emitting economies going forward. It's very important. The transformation will require substantial reallocation of capital that is available today, capital that we need to mobilize going forward. And I think it's important that the economies that are less developed then get a fair share of the allocation of that capital, which is available to us for this exercise, for this very important, if you like, commitment. We need to reduce emissions, yes. We need to put in place the infrastructure that will avoid locking in future, high emission activities. So we nip them in the bud, so to say, for lack of a better word. I think it's essential that we do that. We also need, yes, we talk about markets, carbon markets, we talk about pricing. I think that's not enough. We do need to have structured, clearly structured markets, steps that are required to reach or to operate in those markets. And the issue around pricing becomes extremely important. And I think it's important that this is taken seriously, because in the countries where we are, today you receive a proposal for a carbon project. You don't know how to respond to it. Clearly, it is delaying the processes. It is also possibly leading to suboptimality along the way and will not allow us to achieve the intended objectives. So that takes me to the next issue. What should be done? What should we do in order for us to effectively participate in the carbon markets and generate the carbon financing or support the generation of the carbon financing for this transformation? Number one, I already mentioned, structured markets. Very, very essential. Deepen these markets. I'm talking about what you're already doing. We need to domesticate that in our own countries, to replicate, if you like, what you're doing in our own countries. And the pricing comes with it, obviously, but the instruments must be very clear. I think that's the message I'm giving. Structured markets, pricing, how do we get there? How do we look at a project that comes on the way? How do we assess it? We need what I call a walking path. I think it will be very helpful if we can get that cleared. Very essential to all of us. Number two, we need institutional and technical capacity to be able to allow us to just manage this new field. We have set up a Ministry of Green Economy ourselves, but this is the first time the ministry has been set up. It's learning. They have to benchmark. I think you are the basis. The nations of the North are the basis to assist us to benchmark so we can avoid reinventing the wheel, losing time, and therefore being wasteful in the resource envelope that is always limited. So we believe that institutional technical capacity support strengthening around the carbon markets and pricing is very important. Number three, it is important to articulate the array of benefits. As we engage, we, the developing countries, we define the market, how to price, how do we cascade these benefits to the communities who are usually the poorer sectors of our own societies? How do we convince these communities that depend on the forest and do negative things that damage the environment and climate? How do we pull them in quickly to get a buy-in from them? Because we are able to illustrate, we're able to indicate to them that this is the block of what is available. If you move from these negative activities today, which you are engaging in, which are damaging the climate, and we move this way, this will be the return to you. This will sustain your livelihood. I think these are the three key things that I wanted to share with the platform today. In conclusion, really, COP28 should deliver and conclude on the mechanics of compliance to carbon markets. This is said to be a COP of action, a COP for action. And we're glad to hear some of the announcements that were made in the opening session there, that at least we're getting commitment on climate financing, 30 billion to start with. But here are also areas that are required to be checklisted in our action plan to make sure that the structuring, the pricing of the markets, and then devolving into the benefit structure. Because if the communities don't see the benefits clearly, they will resist, they will cheat. They will probably do things such as what sometimes Africans do. They'll say yes when they're looking at you, but they mean no, and they'll continue doing negative things. So I think that's the issue. That's our message. Let's work together. We are committed, fully committed, as leaders, as governments, and then we can use that to pull our people along, committed to this approach, because there is no option to this approach. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Your Excellency. And I now call Managing Director Georgieva to take the floor. Please.
Thank you to the European Union for bringing us together. I cannot think of a more important topic than accelerating decarbonization on the basis of pricing carbon. We heard from Prime Minister Sanchez. The IMF research shows that the path of finding money for decarbonization by borrowing is not one that countries can follow, whereas the path of pricing carbon is pragmatic, it is leading to more revenues, creates incentives for changing behavior, and it is equitable. So let me make 3 points. One, is it possible for us to decarbonize fast enough without pricing carbon? The answer is no. We have studied that, and it is conclusively that pricing carbon is necessary for speed of transformation. Second, at what level should carbon be priced? Let's look at where we are today. As we heard from Ursula, we have just close to 25% of emissions covered. When we look at this coverage, the average price for these emissions is $20 per ton. Where should we be by 2030 if we want to keep 1.5 degree alive? We should be somewhere around $80 per ton. Well, since we know that we have 75% of emissions still to cover, what is actually our average price today? Who can quickly bring some math in action? $5 a ton. So we have a way to go, and we need to go up faster. My third point is about the role of the IMF in supporting our members. What we are advocating is the following. You can price carbon in different ways. The best way, the most efficient way, is by taxing carbon. Taxes are easy to execute, and countries that have chosen to tax carbon have shown that they continue to grow while their emissions go down. But taxing carbon is not politically viable in some countries, and we have no time to build political viability. Therefore, we accept and actually recommend countries to follow other approaches. For example, the one that is so popular in the European Union, trade. When we allow trade to bring emissions down, we see how impactful it is. It also raises revenues. But we are so much under the gun to move that we should be also accepting regulatory approaches. In other words, indirectly pricing carbon by gradually increasing standards that leads to industries and ultimately consumers paying the price for carbon in that way. As an institution, we have been advocating very strongly for building the biggest possible tent for all pricing approaches, and then working with our partners, the World Bank, OECD, the World Trade Organization, to create two types of equivalency. First, equivalence of tax, trade, and regulatory compliance. Second, equivalency of carbon price vis-a-vis level of economic development. Rich countries pay more. Middle-income countries pay less. Low-income countries, some are willing to see a price of carbon, but maybe some that are fragile states, we have to say, we accept that you are not part of that equation today. So if we go the way of equivalency of carbon price, and then we work hard to build the different approaches in a way of compatibility, we are taking out the argument, oh, politically very difficult, maybe in 5 years' time somebody would do it. Then we say we all need to move on carbon price today. Ngozi, I want to praise her for putting pressure on institutions. We came finally together with a task force to do exactly that, work on equivalency and make sure that carbon price is something that is not talked about, but it exists everywhere. Thank you to Zambia for talking of one particular aspect of the carbon market, voluntary carbon market. And Ajay is going to tell you how the World Bank is going to make what you advocate for come true. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Georgieva. And now I call President Banga to take the floor.
Thank you for getting us together, Ursula, and thank you all. You're going to, from me, hear a number of points that everybody else has spoken to. I'm going to try and bring it together with what the World Bank is trying to do. I think just yesterday there was a very sobering analysis that we all read that says that 2024 is headed to be the hottest year on record. Clearly, humanity's pathway on climate is currently not going in the right direction. That's the first issue which we have to accept. But don't forget, we can still turn the tide, and we are not starting at square one, because every day, millions of people around the world try to make their own way of offering help to change the tide. So if you go to Nigeria, you will find shopkeepers using distributed solar energy to keep their medicines preserved, but also to keep shops open at night. If you go to Indonesia, you find mangroves are being replanted, and an effort is being made by communities to benefit from that mangrove replantation, not just for carbon, but for their community to prosper in that space. So people are trying. The question, therefore, is, if we have all these solutions, what's holding us back? And that is the resources. So for 20 years, the World Bank has been devoted to validating and working sound, transparent carbon markets that result in real climate mitigation, to Prime Minister Sanchez's point, mitigation, and deliver tangible benefits. We have hit a milestone in this long journey. In fact, my colleagues are here who've been working on this. In the next year, after a decade of collaboration, the first high-integrity carbon credits from forestry will begin to hit the market, potentially delivering 24 million credits before the end of 2024. These first forestry credits are arriving from Vietnam, from Guatemala, and from the Democratic Republic of Congo, among others. We are working with another 11 countries. That could bring us to 126 million credits once they complete the process. Ultimately, These credits have the potential to transfer billions of dollars into communities from companies, from governments voluntarily. But this is just the beginning of the pipeline that I believe high integrity credits can come from many more countries. What makes these credits unique and of high integrity are two things. And the first is environmental integrity. We ensure that the credits are unique, not duplicated and double counted, that they are real, that they are permanent, and they are measurable. So they are standards. And social integrity. We make certain that the majority of benefits flow to local communities and to indigenous people. These assurances are, I think, a crucial part of the complex puzzle that has held back the resources that is required for these carbon credits to achieve their potential. Validation is the backbone of healthy markets. It feeds investor confidence. It generates better prices. It enables countries blessed with natural resources to see the value in protecting those assets. We believe that this approach will allow carbon markets to become more liquid, transparent, which I think is really important, and a better deal for developing countries who should get paid for their contributions that benefit all of us. But this is not the end of our ambition. We want to scale this model across our portfolio. We want to apply it to organic carbon in soil. We want to apply it to the energy transition and to mangroves. At the global level, we are partnering with key players to remove the most critical impediments for carbon market expansion, including setting standards to what the President of Zambia said, clarifying the legal nature of carbon credits, and helping countries set up the necessary infrastructure to connect to global carbon markets. For example, together with the government of Singapore, we are connecting fragmented registries into one global climate action data trust using open source technology. If we can make progress on unifying fragmented markets and replicate this work around the world, I believe we unleash a very powerful tool that sort of helps to combat climate change and development and erodes inequality. But I don't want to give you the impression that this is going to be easy and that this success is just around the corner. This is hard. We will get criticized because we will all make mistakes in the journey. It will take time. It will require consensus. It will require difficult decisions. But we need to get it done because there is no other way for scalable resources to reach the developing world to compensate them for what we all need to have happen over the coming years. So keep in mind that forecasts are not destiny. And if there is validation in the origins of the World Bank, it is that we can do big things together. If we seize these solutions at hand, if we come together in common cause with the full focus of our creativity, and most importantly, with our sincerity of purpose, we can change the horizon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, President Banga. And now, last but not least, my pleasure to call to the podium Director General Okonjo Iweala. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. As the last speaker, a lot has been said, so let me try and build on that. But I want to start by thanking the EU and Ursula for inviting us, and it's wonderful to be with my brother, President Hiklema, Prime Minister Sanchez, and of course, Kristalina and Ajay, always good to be with you. Since taking office as the Director General of the WTO, I've made the case that international trade has a pivotal role to play in achieving our shared climate objectives. We've all heard the bad news, but we've also heard, as Ajay said, the fact that we can still do something about it. The International Energy Agency estimates that meeting the 1.5-degree target is still possible, provided we slash fossil fuel demand by undertaking a massive policy-driven increase in clean energy capacity and energy efficiency with global green investment, especially in developing economies. But the issue is the amount we need to spend. We need to go from 1.8 trillion this year to 4.5 trillion annually by the early 2030s. I want you to keep that figure in mind because this is why carbon pricing is important. And we have to spend this money in a world in which even capital-rich advanced economies are canceling some projects, and including in solar and wind, due to higher borrowing costs. So this is a big concern. So it means that trying to meet the challenge of net zero by 2050 requires every tool in our toolkit. And that is why carbon pricing is crucial. It's a potent policy instrument that directly imposes an economic cost on greenhouse gas emission. Of course, as economists, we love it. Carbon pricing can operate through various mechanisms, from carbon taxes to emissions trading systems, commonly known as cap and trade. But whatever form it takes, putting a price on carbon sends a clear economic signal to emitters, incentivizing reduced energy consumption and greater investment in clean energy technologies. Carbon pricing is powerful because it harnesses market forces to drive change. It penalizes businesses and entrepreneurs who continue to rely on carbon-intensive status quo, and it offers them large economic rewards for innovating, developing, and scaling up low-carbon solutions. In essence, carbon pricing aligns economic self-interest with environmental stewardship. Internalizing the cost of carbon emissions places the burden of responsibility for carbon pollution on the individual actors and industries that contribute the most significantly to the problem. But that said, carbon pricing does have distributional consequences, both within countries and across countries. So addressing these effects, for instance, by redirecting a share of carbon revenues to low-income households and to climate finance for the just transition to low-income countries, is crucial. It's an element of the just transition. Now, I want to touch on one very important problem from the perspective of trade that Ajay touched upon when he spoke. The rationale for carbon pricing has spawned many initiatives. In fact, the World Bank has counted that there are 73 different carbon pricing schemes that are in operation globally. However, they only cover 23% of total emissions, as Kristalina said, and the schemes vary widely in coverage and stringency, with carbon prices ranging from less than $1 per ton of CO2 to more than $130 per ton of CO2. Now, the fragmented landscape of carbon pricing and of climate policies more generally creates a patchwork of regulations, making it challenging for businesses, especially micro, medium, and small enterprises, to navigate. And I've been speaking to many businesses and those in my Business Advisory Council. This is a big problem for them. Beyond these higher costs, compliance costs, fragmentation in carbon pricing has the potential to become a source of trade frictions. And this is where it's of concern to the WTO. As trading partners grapple with different regulatory environments and carbon pricing structures, perceptions that the competitive playing field is unfairly tilted one way or the other could foster trade tensions, potentially escalating into tit-for-tat retaliation. We are witnessing such concerns already at the WTO. And I just want to say thank you to Ursula, because we've invited the EU is coming on the 18th of December to engage with other members of the WTO, to listen to them, explain what problems they have, and also to explain the EU's approach. This is what we need. And we're ready at the WTO to be a forum for dialogue, for bringing people together. That's what we're doing. We don't want the tit-for-tat retaliation. We want to work together. And that's a big point I want to make. At this critical juncture, coordination on carbon pricing is a necessity to manage the trade tensions we're seeing and preempt disputes. We don't want people coming to the WTO dispute settlement system because of issues related to carbon pricing. We want to tackle that ahead. And so we have to be innovative. And we've heard several suggestions. At the WTO, we're working on an approach that takes into account not only the level of development of countries, but also current, it's dynamic, current, future, and past emissions. Taking those into account, We're also looking to see how can the revenues that might be generated from a unified approach or a coordinated approach be redirected to developing countries, as I said, to help them meet the cost of the transition. Now, that is why our agencies here have gotten together, the IMF, World Bank, OECD, and ourselves, and the UN. We are going to get together, or we have gotten together, to form a task force to try and put together this common approach to carbon pricing. We'll soon hold our first meeting, and we hope we'll come up with something that will help everyone. So let me conclude by saying, look, carbon pricing is an invaluable tool in the battle against climate change. Trade policy is a powerful lever for driving emissions reductions down, and that's why we're working on it. And all I can say is that I'm looking forward to getting all of us together to deliver an answer for the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Director General. Now, this brings us to the end of our list of speakers, but not quite to the end of our event. We're now going to move the lecterns on the side, and I will invite all of our speakers to come for a group photo. But please stay seated until we have moved the lecterns. Thank you very much to all.